2:45 a.m. By this point in the battle, the peninsula jutting into Lake Belton within the Fort Hood area had been horribly saturated by a grand total of 160 Chinese howitzers firing up and down, saturating entire grids of this peninsula, in conjunction with 80 total 122 millimeter rocket artillery projectors firing their 122 millimeter rockets in the form of the PHL 81 battalions, which each had a grand total of 40 rocket projectors. When combined, it numbered 80. With the PLL 66 battalions, 2 of each, numbering 80 of those howitzers, and the PLL-01 towed howitzers, which were 155 millimeter howitzers, also numbering a grand total of 80. With all of this heavy fire from the 203rd Field Artillery Brigade saturating the area, most of the American artillery elements that were training, which essentially was the 2nd of the 82nd, which was a full artillery battalion of the 1st Cav, the 3rd of the 16th, another full battalion, with an additional firing battery, which was essentially a company-sized element, but in artillery terms, from the 1st of the 82nd, also a 1st Cav, and a single firing battery from 3rd ACR, being its Alpha battery from its Steel Squadron, or also called King Battery, which was M777 howitzers, comprising a total of 10 full firing batteries between them, having had been badly destroyed as the enormous artillery barrage methodically went up and down throughout the peninsula before shifting to terrain denial strikes to pen in the remaining surviving forces before Chinese maneuver battalions in the form of 1 mechanized infantry and 1 armored battalion from the 112th Combined Arms Brigade moved into the area, when the fire mission shifted again from terrain denial to precision strike, as ISR assets from all the way at the high altitude level from the 3 different reconnaissance drones, the 2 WZ-7s and WZ-8 high-altitude stealth drone, in conjunction with the lower-level, squad-level reconnaissance quadcopter drones, which could beam in the precise coordinates for precision strike operations. As that was occurring, and PLA forces were already beginning the process of doing their battle damage assessments, as well as sweeping the peninsula for any potential remaining surviving dismounted forces, as all the vehicles and artillery pieces had by this point been completely destroyed. In the other battle that was occurring at this same exact time that was going on in the central northwestern portion of the post was beginning to wrap up between 2 Russian mechanized infantry battalions from the 15th Separate Motor Rifle Brigade, forming a wedge with a armored battalion and other additional mechanized infantry battalion forming the southern portion of this wedge, trapping and destroying American mixed armored formations, as previously gone over within this sub-series of the Fort Hood battle out of the larger hypothetical invasion documentary series. At the same time, at 2:45, as these events here were wrapping up, and this one had already concluded, Russian forces moved on the 1st Squadron of 3rd ACR, one of the last remaining armed combatant American units left on the main installation, which had by this point been horribly mauled by artillery strikes coming from the 40 self-propelled howitzers of the 17th Armored Brigade's single artillery battalion, having had fired, badly decimating its headquarters of headquarters troop, which was essentially its headquarters company of the battalion, of the squadron, which was a battalion in Cav terms, as well as badly goring its Delta or D troop, which was its support and logistical element, leaving only most of its combat troops, which was its Alpha, Bravo, and Charlie troops, it remaining intact. although they had lost several vehicles each, which at the opening of hostilities, as some of this battalion were badly destroyed by the artillery fire, they had shifted their positions slightly until realizing that in the north of them, Chinese forces in the form of one Armored Battalion and one short-range air defense artillery battalion, also from the 17th Armored Brigade, had positioned themselves directly to their north to guard the rear flank of the attacking earlier force of one Armored Battalion that continued moving on to the north to surround and destroy American Air Defense Forces, themselves part of the 69th Air Defense Artillery Brigade, in their SEAD, or Suppression of Enemy Air Defense Operation, which was one of the first actions to occur within this battle. These two battalions that were covering the rear flank of this attacking battalion that conducted the SEAD operation were still in place, with the artillery fire coming from the 40 PLZ-05 howitzers shifting from precision strike fire early on against the battalion to now terrain denial to prevent them from escaping east and towards Interstate 35 was a key issue. Prevent them from reaching the interstate altogether entirely. And they were left to the attacking Russian forces from the 16th Tank Division, now slicing their way through the installation to finish them off. And the Chinese forces would remain in a blocking position to the north to capture or destroy any stragglers who attempted to retreat from the oncoming Russians coming into the area. As that had occurred, the original four Armored Battalions and 4 Armored Infantry, or essentially mechanized infantry that were part of the 16th Tank Division battalions here, and the 4 other logistical and support battalions of the 105th Logistical Support Brigade that had smashed their way deep into the installation were arriving. They had shedded some of their combat units, such as a battalion in this direction and 2 battalions to the north of this armored force that was still located in the geographic center of the installation where they had been training at the initiation of hostilities. It is important to understand that even 2 hours and 45 minutes into the entire invasion, and including into this battle itself, that this is still very, very early on in the entire invasion, and even in this battle, as this battle would continue for many hours after the main fighting wrapped up only 4 hours into the invasion, as this was a humongous area to cover in terms of its overall landmass, and including all the forces that were engaged upon it. Although 3/4 of them were still on the main post when the invasion kicked off and were rapidly either destroyed, outright annihilated, or captured by this point, of the 1/4 still out in the training areas, there were 2 surviving combat elements that still remained intact, or relatively intact for the time being. And that was the remains of the 1st of the 3rd and the remaining mixed armored forces in the middle of the post that were about to be engaged by 2 Chinese battalions in the form of a combat engineer battalion and the other armored battalion, also belonging to the 112th Combined Arms Brigade, that had previously paused for a logistical resupply effort and refueling before continuing deeper into the installation, as this was a massive installation. The Russian forces, having logistical elements trailing behind them, had done similar when they had stopped just north of the Robert Gray Army Airfield before continuing, engaging and destroying forces north of the main post, as well as splitting up into 3 prongs, with 5 full combat battalions of the former 8 battalions continuing on to engage the remains of the 1st Squadron of 3rd ACR, with 1 battalion moving to the south of the Chinese forces that had moved into the peninsula to clear it of American artillery elements, as well as 2 battalions hooking off to the northwest to block any escape by American armored forces who were about to be engaged by not just Chinese ground forces in the form of the 2 attacking battalions, but also heavy air power in the form of the last 2 remaining strategic bombers out of the 8-bomber squadron that hadn't as of yet dropped their entire payloads, and were about to aid their ground troops by conducting a large strategic air raid on these forces. In other words, the attacks that were imminently about to occur at 2:45 on the 1st of the 3rd, and against these mixed American armored forces, essentially from 1st Cav, right in the middle of the post, were about to be assaults conducted with extreme prejudice and a very heavy hand, with air power involved in both and land power in the form of very potent ground vehicles attacking in conjunction with their air support, loitering munitions, and even armed drones assisting in the assault against the armored forces themselves. With the Russians now moving into this area, the 5 combat battalions, consisting of 3 mechanized infantry battalions and 2 armored battalions, having shedded 2 of its mechanized infantry battalions to the north here and 1 armored down here, they were moving in and engaging the forces of 3rd ACR with their very potent T-80 main battle tanks, as well as the BMPT-Terminator vehicles of their anti-tank companies of the armored battalions, as well as BMP-3 and MTLBs in the form of BMP-3s being infantry fighting vehicles and the MTLBs being the armor personnel carriers insofar as all the combat vehicles, and would also be supported by the drone sections of the headquarters companies of these battalions, firing 5 Lancet drones apiece from each of their Lancet 3 5-railed track-based drone launching systems, as each battalion's headquarters company had a dedicated drone section to the Lancet 3s within it. Going to the map, essentially directly north of this 2 by 2 mile area is one combat company of the American 1st of the 3rd, 1st Squadron of 3rd ACR, moving into the area as it is being badly pummeled by artillery that had been, up until this point, utilized as a terrain denial strike to block eastward escape for these forces, including even down in this area, until Russian forces were beginning to move in, and the artillery fire was reshifted to other areas, forcing the last surviving combat company of the 1st of the 3rd, or 1st Squadron of 3rd ACR, its Alpha Company, to move down into this area in conjunction with dismounted troops that were survivors of the headquarters of Headquarters Troop and Delta Troop, or D Troop, which was essentially its logistical and support elements, which by this point had lost everything to artillery fire from the Chinese. And many of their troops, although there were some survivors that were moving down in this prong with the surviving Alpha Company, which itself had lost some of its vehicles as well, due to the heavy artillery fire from the 40 different guns, or field guns, of the PLZ-05s of the 17th Armored Brigade of the PLA's 68th Group Army, which was about to shift their fire in support of the advancing Russian forces moving in. This whole force right here, just being one entire battalion, essentially. These 20 tanks were the leading tank company of the Armored Battalion, with an additional armored company moving in this way in a double staggered column formation. Another one that stopped right here, another full armored company, and its last full armored company maneuvering in to outflank these 2 American Stryker companies that were aligned on a line facing to the south. This was the main range road that's on top of this steep incline right here, this cliff, or ridge line right here, essentially. This steeply elevated area that was the base of this main road, this main range road that went around the installation in a large circle that the Russian forces, after defeating the Americans, would secure and take all the way to North Fort Hood before leaving the installation entirely to pursue the American forces that fled at the very beginning of the operation, that at the very beginning were unable to be physically reached at the moment by the forces of the 15th Separate Motor Rifle Brigade, as they had other forces they had to engage along the way, giving them time to flee, including the 4-9 Cav, which was of the 2nd Brigade of 1st Cav, as well as these mixed infantry dismounted forces practicing patrolling operations, as well as the 91st Brigade Engineering Battalion, which hurriedly fled the area and didn't even stop for anything, not even to engage with these mixed American armored forces here. They were already taking heavy shelling just as they were, because at the beginning the mixed armored forces took shelling as well, and so did they, which spurred them to leave. Although it scattered these forces, and it took roughly an entire hour just to get them back into some semblance of an organized force, as again, due to the lack of communications, there being no satellite-based anything, no internet-based anything due to the cyber strikes, including military networks, and no radio communication due to the electronic warfare jamming. Everything had to be done within line of sight, which made reorganizing this force exceedingly difficult and tasking and time-consuming, which even allowed the Russians to decide to back off of their artillery fire, to send in maneuver units to intercept, interdict, and basically just destroy them as they tried to move deeper into the installation instead of out of it and search for more help, not realizing that friendly additional units of theirs had already fled the installation. So at this point, with the 1st Squadron of 3rd ACR having been badly mauled by early on artillery fire, in conjunction with being fixed in place by some of its elements on foot, realizing there were Chinese forces directly north of them, they stayed in place, and they were relatively fearful of any movement in any direction. So they decided to basically stay in place, except for a short reshifting slightly to the south and west to avoid the fire that was coming in the form of the artillery going from precision strikes against its headquarters elements and its Delta troop, or its logistical and support forces, and shifting to terrain denial to prevent them from fleeing to the east. So they shifted their direction slightly to the south and west, as one of their troops or companies was already in a location just to the south and west of the artillery fire and the Chinese forces. So the rest of the 1st Squadron shifted to go and meet with them to try to regather their whole squadron in the same manner that was done with these armored forces due to the artillery fire against them by the Russian forces. So by the time they were moving into this area, essentially, and the other last surviving combat company, which was its Alpha Troop or A Troop, was moving into the area along with dismounted survivors from the earlier strikes against Delta and also the headquarters of headquarters troops. You have to understand that these forces initially were spread out somewhat in different camping. Campsite belonged only Charlie, which was already out in this area with its headquarters right here in this campsite or bivouac area, with this other headquarters element moving in as Bravo Troop moved into the area as well, and Alpha Troop was following behind with the surviving stragglers coming from the headquarters of Headquarters Troop and Delta Troop, which were badly destroyed in the early on artillery fire before it changed to terrain denial. With all of these forces concentrating and trying to remuster their strength in this area, the Russian forces now moving in to the area had their ISR dominance, along with the Chinese WZ-7 drone, high-altitude reconnaissance drone, monitoring all this activity, allowing for these Russian forces with their squad and platoon-level ISR quadcopter recon assets to fly over and along with the high-altitude drone, call in precise artillery strikes and a close air support mission from 2 pairs of Chinese J-11 fighter aircraft with their accompanying FH-97A fighter drones, which were, by this point, heavily laden with air-to-ground munitions. The other aircraft, only one out of one of the pairs is in this picture here, but the rest of them are off the map and to the north, hitting the flanks of the Alpha troop as it was advancing into this area, and the dismounts, the survivors essentially of the Delta troop or D troop, its headquarters its headquarters troop, its Delta troop, which was the Delta was the logistical and support elements. The headquarters troop was its command elements and some additional logistical assets. And the Alpha troop was its last remaining combat company, which isn't completely pictured, but part of it is one lead vehicle of one platoon and the lead 4 vehicles comprising another platoon, as there were 3 combat platoons and its headquarters platoon. The headquarters platoon and the other combat platoon that were remaining that are not pictured had already lost a few vehicles in the artillery strikes that opened up the hostilities. With the other aircraft, the other single fighter, J-11 fighter, and its drone, its accompanying FH-97A drone, off the map and to the north, with the full other pair with them firing KD-88 air-to-ground TV seeker-guided missiles in conjunction with strafing and dropping laser-guided 500-pound munitions on specific vehicles, like is done right here. By the time this J-11 gets to this point, it drops a laser-guided 500-pound munition on these 2 vehicles right here, destroying both and horribly damaging this one from the back, while also following its earlier fired missiles as they were flying back into the area, again, from having done an RTB to reload and change out many of their air-to-ground munitions for air-to-ground munitions. They had fired their KD-88s from many miles away, so they're basically following along the same path that their earlier fired missiles are following, and this one came in and hit these 3 vehicles right here early on. This one was coming in to hit this campsite. Or I'm sorry, the ones fired from the drone, the 2 KD-88s fired from further away, come in and hit these 2 vehicles. One KD-88 hits these vehicles, and one KD-88 hits this campsite right here, this group of vehicles and an edge of the campsite that was part of the original Charlie company, or Charlie troop that was already in the area, with Bravo moving in here and Alpha coming in from the north. Alpha was being hit by additional KD-88s, laser-guided air-to-ground munitions, as well as also being strafe attacked by the air support, and also now being hit by artillery fire with precise coordinates being called in by the WZ-7 high-altitude recon drone, in conjunction with also Russian quadcopter reconnaissance assets, literally flying over the vehicles they want hit and radioing in the coordinates where the vehicles were anticipated to be within a few minutes as they were moving to the south, before moving out of the area and allowing for the artillery fire to come in and completely annihilate Alpha troop. Alpha troop ceased to exist due to the combo of artillery fire, KD-88 air-to-ground missiles, as well as laser-guided, precision-dropped air-to-ground munitions in the form of the laser-guided bombs dropped by the J-11s and their fighter drone accompanying aircraft in the form of the FH-97As, who were also conducting strafing attacks as well in support of these ground troops. The lead company leading the attack of one of the two armored battalions, as well as there were 3 additional battalions that were off this map that consisted of 3 armored infantry battalions, but there were the 2 tank battalions. This is only one whole battalion attacking. Off the map, guarding the flanks, was one full armored infantry company just to the east off this map, and another one to the west, with an additional armored battalion behind this armored battalion to the south, and an armored infantry battalion of the 3 total behind it. So essentially only pictured as one full battalion. This is the lead elements of one of the battalion's tank companies. This is part of its headquarters company. This is the anti-tank company moving in. This is one of its armored infantry companies moving in here. This is one of its other tank companies out of the 4. And this is the last tank company right here, and the last armored infantry company moving in here to support the armor. So essentially, as this battle unfolded at 2:45, what was occurring, this right here was a headquarters force. This was a headquarters platoon, not the headquarters company over the whole battalion, but this was a headquarters platoon of this armored company right here. It was left further back where it would be safer, as the American forces and their Strykers, they had the Stryker Dragoon and the ICV, which was the Dragoon was the infantry fighting vehicle version that had a very powerful 30mm autocannon, very destructive, and the ICV, or the infantry, essentially the APC version, which was the infantry carrier vehicle, which is the APC version of the Stryker, whereas the Dragoon is the infantry fighting vehicle version of it. The infantry carrier vehicle version, which is the armor personnel carrier vehicle of the Stryker, which was that version of the Stryker, had Mark 19s or 50 cals mounted alternatively throughout these different platoons. So you would have vehicles that might have, you could have a mix and match with vehicles having 50s, with 2 vehicles having 50s, one having a Mark 19, and then you have the Dragoon with its 30mm autocannon, or you might have 2 with Mark 19s and 1 with 50 mounted on the APC versions with the Dragoon and its 30 autocannon. So you had a mix and match of the Mark 19s and the 50 cals on the armor personnel carrier versions, or the ICVs, the infantry carrier vehicles of the Strykers, with the Dragoon being the infantry fighting vehicle with its very potent 30mm autocannon. As the battle unfolded, there were dismounted American squads within this wooded scrub brush and mesquite wood forested or wooded areas, as the installation was full of these types of foliage and terrain and wooded areas, and they had set up in wedge formations to be able to fire in 3 directions towards the encroaching enemy forces as they advanced, with these Russian leading forces being their 1 tank company that was leading the entire tank battalion or armored battalion into battle, taking heavy fire from the IFVs firing their 30mm autocannon, as well as fire from 50 cal Mark 19s, also these dismounts firing a few of their AT-4 weapons that they actually had on them. And one even fired a Javelin, destroying one of the T-80 tanks. But most of the Americans were destroyed before they were even able to actually do any type of real severe damage to the Russian attackers, because as the airstrikes were coming in and the loitering munition strikes were coming in the form of 10 total Lancet 3s that were fired by the 2 armored battalions that were present, with this one and the one right behind it with their headquarters companies, this being part of the headquarters company, firing the Lancets at very close range too. It didn't take them very long to arrive at their targets, and nor did it take the close air support from the J-11 strikes and the FH-97A strikes, which accompanied the 4 attacking J-11s. Only one on this map is seen, with the missiles coming in from another off map that are seen right here, hitting this area, as well as this missile fired from this one further away, hitting this area as well. And the 2 missiles from this FH-97A flying in and destroying these 2 Strykers right here on this ridge line, hitting them. The combination of the loitering munition strikes, 5 right here, hitting all these headquarters vehicles and troops. These were armed with thermobaric warheads, so these decimated these forces. And the artillery fire coming in, even these fleeing dismounts from this headquarters camp right here, this headquarters platoon, they were fleeing the area, but they were picked off and destroyed by Chinese artillery, as well as taking fire from tank shells fired from well over a mile away from these advancing Russian armored forces that were firing on the move, firing their fragmentation tank shells with Chinese artillery hitting them, just decimated them, with Chinese artillery hitting just to the north of this headquarters element, this headquarters platoon of Bravo troop right here that had moved in with the headquarters camp. This was the actual campsite of Charlie troop, or Charlie company essentially, or Charlie troop. Its headquarters platoon right here behind this hill, this highly elevated hill. It was being hit by Lancet 3s. The other part of their camp was being hit by KD-88 air-to-ground missiles fired from further away as these aircraft came in to strafe and drop precision laser-guided munitions on other targets of Bravo troop right here. It was a relatively quick battle. This battle ended within merely 15 minutes of its beginning, although it was very intense for the amount of time that it lasted, as the Lancets fired from the other armored battalion that was behind this attacking battalion within this map were hitting Bravo troop exceedingly hard, as this Stryker tried to maneuver out of the way to offer some fire support on top of this steeply elevated terrain for the Strykers down in here, and for these retreating troops that sought to move back up the hill to establish a position here to fire down at the attacking enemy forces. As it was about to move into the area, it was hit by a Lancet 3. 2 of these were hit by Lancet 3s, and in conjunction with tank fire. Fire was coming from these BMPT-Terminators firing their attk missiles, firing their 30mm autocannons at these Strykers and troops that were laying down in the prone position on top of this steeply elevated terrain, this ridge line right here. They were laying down as heavy a fire as they could in terms of the volume of fire, but they were eventually simply destroyed. I mean, the sheer number of fragmentation shells that were fired at the dismounts, the 30mm autocannon fire, and then fire from the grenade launchers as they got closer, just decimated all these forces, in conjunction with the tank gunfire, the 125mm fragmentation shells hitting these troops, with the heat shells hitting and destroying these vehicles as well. The heat shells hitting at about the same time that these KD-88 strikes were hitting these vehicles. And the heat shells were specifically designed to destroy tanks or armored vehicles anyhow. And some of them were even hit by Sabo ammunition, which shredded right through these vehicles. Although the best shell to use against these types of lighter armored vehicles would have been the heat ammunition especially. But the Strykers were just being decimated. They were being ripped apart by anti-tank guided missiles from these anti-tank vehicles, these BMPT Terminators, firing, especially the lead 2 here mostly, firing at the vehicles, as well as firing the grenade launchers at the areas where there were dismounts, including up on this ridgeline as they got closer to it. and the tank shells being fired in massive volumes by this leading attacking armored company in their inverted wedge formations, their V formations, which was a type of a attacking formation for the vehicles. And this additional company of T-80 tanks was moving through this wooded area down here, this area of scrub brush and mesquite woods, at the bottom of the base of this ridge line right here, with this tank sort of like coming off of the ridge as the elevation was relatively steep. It was sort of rolled down this way. The others came up around as the elevation was a little less steep up here, and they were to outflank these forces. Although there were a few American surviving dismounts that were able to offer some fire at these forces, they completely destroyed them as they moved from around the back of this hill right here, the steeply elevated hill, to this area here. They were intercepted by the armor and destroyed as they rapidly advanced, surrounding these forces from the side, outflanking them and hitting them in a complete L shape, hitting them from this way as the lead tank company fired this way, with artillery coming down and pounding to the north and to the slight east, northeast, as well as the air-fired munitions from the J-11 fighter aircraft and the FH-97As, hitting various targets of their own. All of this was ISR directed from the high-altitude reconnaissance drones of the Chinese and the low-altitude squad and platoon-level reconnaissance drones of the Russians at the lowest levels of this battle here, all the way up to the highest altitude level of the Chinese WZ-7 drone that was orbiting the area, picking out targets for artillery, and also in conjunction with the lower altitude recon drones also aiding in this effort to pick targets. And precise artillery fire and precision airstrikes being called in, along with Lancet 3s, tank shells, anti-tank guided missiles fired from the tanks, as T-80 tanks could fire anti-tank guided missiles from their breech as well, from their bore, and also so could the ATGMs be fired in the form of the attakas from the leading anti-tank vehicles of the anti-tank company, these BMPT-Terminator vehicles right here moving into the area. These dismounted American infantry troops were completely wiped out early on in the fighting as these tanks took fire from these wooded areas here. They levied an enormous amount of shells and 12.7 millimeter turret fire from the tops of their turrets, from the turret gunners, also coax machine gun fire into these areas, and the lead Terminator vehicles fired 30 millimeter autocannon ammunition and grenades into these areas as they moved into the area and got ever closer. And essentially, these forces on the ridge lines, as these troops dismounted from this Stryker before it was hit and destroyed by a tank shell, with these other two being destroyed by Lancet, moved into position to line up on this ridge line to lay down fire. Fragmentation tank shells were hitting this ridge line, and they had already wiped out these troops, as well as a Lancet 3 hitting this vehicle as it tried to maneuver around to provide support to hitting infantry troops of this dismounted squad that was down here, as their other squad that they had bounded and covered into the area with was eliminated by tank shell fire and machine gun fire from the coax machine guns and turret machine guns of the tanks, and they were taking heavy fire, so they had to withdraw from the area as their Strykers of the other company of Charlie had been completely destroyed by this point. Charlie mostly right here, but there was a platoon of Charlie right here, and the rest of these vehicles were Bravo. This was Bravo's combat platoons. Bravo's headquarters platoon and Charlie's headquarters platoon were back here. Charlie was the one that established the tents and their position behind this hill right here, and this wooded area, between the wooded area here and this hill right here, steeply elevated hill on top of this ridge line right here that went through this area. They were being hit by Lancets, artillery fire, air strikes, air-to-ground missiles, and strafing, and also tank shells that made it over this hilltop from this side and from the front. They were making it over the hill and hitting back here. They were completely annihilated, and the artillery coming in just wiped out Alpha as Alpha tried to move into the area. Alpha troop, or Alpha company essentially, was hit by air attack, artillery strikes from the PLA 17th Armored Brigade's artillery battalion firing its 40 howitzers in support of the Russian assault into this area, with Russian tank guns having their fairly long range of over 3 miles firing at Alpha and the dismounts from Delta that survived the initial Chinese barrage. The dismounts from Delta, which was the logistical and support element of the 1st Squadron, there were only some survivors in the form of dismounts, as all the vehicles have been destroyed with the rest of the troops, and also the headquarters of headquarters troops that survived being dismounts moving in with Alpha, but they were hit by the air, they were hit by the artillery, they were hit by some of the tank shells that flew into this area way back here on top of this ridge line that they were coming down. As the range road went up through this area here, it had a gravel road that came into this area along this ridge line as the elevation got a little higher again back here, as it sort of like the elevation started along the road as high right here, and then it got a little lower and a little lower, and then it got a little higher as the road moved to the north and northwest. And there was a graveled road from Alpha's former position that ran to the position of Charlie right here, and also to other training areas to the north and west. And as Bravo set up its headquarters vehicles by the camp that Charlie had and moved this way, they were being hit by the air raid, the air strikes, the close air support strikes, the Lancet 3s, and the tank fire, even fire from the infantry fighting vehicles, such as the 100mm main guns and 30mm autocannons, as these were fired above friendly forces to hit the ridge line where the elevation was higher up, and successfully helped to destroy the dismounted troops as they moved into position in a line formation to establish a line right here to fire down at the armor and at these infantry troops moving in to support the armor forces of the attacking main armored company. As this other armored company hit on the flanks, this one was moving in to leapfrog ahead of the main attacking one that was spread out in its different 4 combat platoons, with its headquarters platoon back here for this company of these combat elements, these 4 combat tank platoons. This one had stopped here completely, but was lobbing shells over a mile to hit these Americans up here. So they had all sorts of interlocking fire from all sorts of different companies of the attacking armored battalion that was in the middle, with the armored infantry forces off the map to both the east and west that were supporting and guarding the flanks of the attacking armored battalion coming up through the center. And again, there was the other armored battalion behind them, and the last armored infantry battalion even further back to the south behind that, the 2nd Armored Battalion of the 2. So this was one full battalion attacking essentially what remained of 1st Squadron of the 3rd ACR. And these vehicles, they started off trying to lay down some heavy fire, but due to the rapidity of and sheer concentration of tank shell and anti-tank guided missile fire from the tanks, also from these Attacca missiles being fired and 30mm autocannon fired from these Russian BMPT-Terminator vehicles, the air attacks and close air support, and the massive artillery strikes from the howitzers of the 17th Armored Brigade's 1 Artillery Battalion, and the outflanking maneuver here. I mean, it was over. It was simply over in 15 minutes. And the remainder of the battle, the clearance of the area to the north to ensure that Alpha and the surviving members of the headquarters troop and Delta troop, which was the logistical and support elements, were thoroughly cleaned up would take approximately another 10 to 15 minutes. So in its totality, the main combat of this battle lasted 15 minutes, with another 15 minutes devoted to maneuvering up the range road and where there were shorter areas to get up to this higher elevation, to sweep the area thoroughly for survivors, including an Alpha troop that was further to the north that took heavy punishing strikes from artillery and from the close air support from the Chinese J-11s and their FH-97A fighter drones that were paired to them, in conjunction with Russian tank shells, which could be fired a relatively long range of just over 3 miles into this area up here as well, and more. So the last 15 minutes was spent just clearing the area of any survivors, with there being scattered firefights with tiny pockets of survivors. One Russian T-80 tank was lost to a Javelin, but there were no other vehicles lost, and essentially the casualties on the Russian side were essentially almost nothing except for the 4 that were lost in the T-80. There were some wounded among the Armored Infantry dismounts, but there were no KIAs. Just the 4 KIAs in the T-80 that was hit by the Javelin. Now that this battle had concluded, by 3:15 a.m., an entirely different battle was going on as the Russians swept through the area and completed their sweeps by 3:15 a.m. At 3:15 a.m., the last major fighting on Fort Hood was about to wrap up between a mixed grouping of 1st Cav's armored forces that were also conducting interoperability training and 2 attacking Chinese battalions, 1 armored and 1 combat engineer, as well as heavy air power in the form of a strategic air raid on these American forces carried out by the last 2 H-6K heavy strategic bombers that haven't as of yet dropped their munitions and had targeted these armored forces as the perfect target for their aerial munitions. As everything was artificial intelligence and ISR directed, the AI had advised the commanders to utilize these last 2 fully loaded H-6Ks against these armored forces, as they had the most potential as far as their ability to put up resistance out of the 1st Squadron of 3rd ACR and these groups of armored forces from 1st Cav right here. As by this point, 1st Squadron had already been attacked by the air anyhow by 2 full pairs of J-11 fighter aircraft, which essentially was 8 total aircraft when counting the 4 J-11s and the FH-97A drones that accompanied them. The last major fighting of the entire Fort Hood battle concludes in the next video in this sub-series of the hypothetical invasion of America via 4th generation warfare doctrines, utilizing real units, equipment, places, real-world conditions, and more.